By the late autumn of 1886, the wheat country south of the Milk River had already begun to smell like winter. It was the kind of smell a man could not describe to anyone who had not lived through a Montana freeze-up. Iron in the air, dry grass turning brittle underfoot, and the faint sweet rot of hail-shattered stalks lying in the fields where the crop had been beaten flat 2 months earlier. Benjamin Hollister, a 41-year-old homesteader with sun-cracked hands and a jaw set too tight for a man his age, walked the length of his ruined south field one final time before turning back toward the wagon road. He did not look at the sky. He had already learned what the sky was capable of doing to a man who trusted it. 8 weeks earlier, a hailstorm the size of a moving mountain had rolled down from the Sweet Grass Hills and stripped his quarter section clean in less than 20 minutes. Ice the size of pullet eggs, some folks said afterward. Others swore they saw stones as big as a man's fist crash through the roof of the Lutheran church 3 miles west of Benjamin's claim. Whatever the truth had been, the result was the same. His wheat was gone. His barley was gone. The kitchen garden his late wife Marta had planted the spring before she died was reduced to shredded green pulp pressed flat against the black soil. 2 weeks after the storm, the bank in Fort Benton sent a man out on a bay mare to explain, in careful, sorrowful language, that the mortgage on the frame house could not be extended a second year. The man had ridden away before sundown with the deed folded neatly inside a leather satchel. Benjamin had watched him go from the porch step without a single word. There was nothing left to say. The house belonged to the bank now. The land, thanks to the Homestead Act of 1862, still belonged to Benjamin so long as he remained on the claim through the winter and proved up his required residence. That was the one thread of ownership the storm and the banker between them had not managed to cut loose. Which was why, on that gray October morning with the smell of iron rising off the fields, Benjamin Hollister stood alone on his ruined homestead and made a decision most of his neighbors would later call the choice of a broken man. He would not leave. He would not winter in town. He would not board with his brother-in-law in Great Falls and lose the claim by absence. He would dig. The idea had come to him 3 nights earlier while lying awake in the cold frame house, listening to the wind push through gaps in the siding where hail had loosened the shakes. He remembered a Norwegian sod farmer he had met near Bismarck years earlier, an old man named Odger Lindquist who had lived one entire winter beneath a hillside in a dugout no bigger than a root cellar, and come out in the spring healthier than most of his above-ground neighbors. Odger had explained the reasoning to Benjamin over coffee in a language half English and half Norwegian, drawing shapes in the dust of the floorboards with the point of a whittling knife. Earth holds heat the way a good stove holds coals, the old man had said. Wind cannot chase what it cannot reach, and a man buried in a bank is not buried. He is protected. Benjamin had not thought about that conversation in nearly 10 years. But standing in his ruined field with the north wind starting to sharpen along the ridge line, he thought about it now. He thought about it very carefully. He looked west toward the long south-facing bend of the Marias River, where the bank rose steep and clay-heavy above the water, catching the low winter sun almost the full length of the shortest days. And for the first time since the hail had come, Benjamin felt something inside his chest that was not quite hope, but was no longer despair. Benjamin rode out to the river bend the following morning before the sun had fully cleared the eastern grass. The old mule, a stubborn gray animal named Cornelius who had somehow survived the hail by hiding beneath the collapsed lean-to, walked beside him on a short lead while Benjamin carried a coil of surveyor's twine, a folding rule, a shovel, and the whittling knife he had inherited from his father. He did not carry a rifle. There was nothing on the river bend worth shooting, and he wanted his hands free for the work of looking. The south-facing bank stretched almost a quarter mile along the slow bend of the Marias, rising in some places to nearly 18 feet above the waterline before flattening into the prairie above. Benjamin walked the length of it twice, first along the top edge, then along the narrow gravel shelf beside the water, studying the clay, the exposed roots of cottonwood and willow, the seams of darker soil where old floods had laid down layers of silt over the centuries. He was not looking for a pretty spot. He was looking for four things Odger Lindquist had described that long ago afternoon in Bismarck. Solid clay for the walls, so they would not crumble under their own weight. A slope steep enough to shed rain but not so steep that the roof would slide down onto itself in the spring thaw. A southern exposure to catch every hour of winter sun the shortened days could offer. And a level shelf at the base high enough above the river that no flood, not even the worst March breakup, could reach the entrance. He found what he wanted a little past midday, roughly 200 yards downstream from where the freight trace crossed the shallow gravel ford. The bank there rose almost 14 feet, deeply undercut by no old flood scars, and the clay ran dense and yellow beneath a thin cap of black prairie soil. A broken cottonwood stump, hollowed by rot but still rooted deep into the top of the bluff, stood almost directly above the spot he had chosen. Benjamin looked up at that stump for a long moment. Then he smiled for the first time in 8 weeks, because that hollow stump, weathered gray and unremarkable to any passing eye, was going to become the chimney no one from the road would ever see. He staked out the dimensions with the surveyor's twine before nightfall. The main room would be 12 feet wide and 16 feet deep, cut straight back into the bank with the doorway facing almost due south. In front of that room he laid out a smaller anteroom, 8 feet by 6, separated from the main chamber by a second interior door. Odger had called it a cold trap. 2 doors instead of one, with a small dead-air space between them, so that when a man came in from the winter cold, the outside air stopped at the first door and the warm inside air stayed put behind the second. It was the same principle Benjamin had once seen used on the entrance to an ice house near St. Paul, only turned inside out for the opposite season. He rode back to the ruined frame house that evening with a rough sketch drawn on the back of a seed catalog, and a list of every board, nail, hinge, and pane of window glass he was going to need to strip from the house before the bank sent someone to secure it. The deed was theirs, but the lumber was still sitting on his claim, and until the assessor rode out to inventory the property in the spring, no one in Fort Benton had any way of knowing what remained standing and what did not. That night, by the light of a single tallow candle at the kitchen table, Benjamin wrote the first entry in a leather-bound journal Marta had given him the Christmas before her illness. October the 14th, 1886. Ground still soft. 8 weeks to freeze up, maybe less. Cornelius sound. Health good. Beginning the dig tomorrow at first light. If this fails, I go into the ground either way. Then he blew out the candle and slept better than he had in 2 months. The digging began on the 15th of October under a sky the color of scoured tin. Benjamin arrived at the river bend before sunrise with Cornelius pulling a small stone boat loaded with picks, shovels, a 2-man crosscut saw he intended to work single-handed, a coil of hemp rope, a bucket, and a canvas tarp for hauling loose dirt down to the gravel shelf beside the water. He had eaten a cold breakfast of bread and salt pork by lantern light in the kitchen of the empty frame house, and he did not expect to eat again until dark. The first cut into the bank went easier than he had feared. The thin cap of black prairie soil peeled away in heavy sods that he stacked carefully along the top of the bluff, keeping the grass side up, because Odger had once told him that stripped sod, if kept alive through the fall, could be laid back over a dugout roof in the spring, and would knit itself into the soil beneath within a single growing season. A dugout covered in living grass, the old Norwegian had said, disappeared into the prairie so completely that a rider could pass within 10 feet and never know a man lived there. Benjamin did not know yet whether he would need to hide his shelter from anyone, but the idea of a home that vanished into the earth appealed to something in him he could not quite name. Beneath the sod, the clay came up in dense yellow chunks that had to be broken loose with the pickaxe before the shovel could move them. The work was brutal on his shoulders and worse on his lower back, but Benjamin had spent 20 years behind a plow and another 8 before that swinging a hammer on railroad section gangs in Minnesota, and his body remembered how to pace itself. He dug in stretches of 40 minutes, then rested for 10, drinking cold river water from a tin cup and letting the sweat freeze slightly along the edges of his collar before starting again. By the end of the first day, he had cut a rough opening 5 feet wide and 4 feet deep into the face of the bank. He rode home in the dark that night with his hands raw beneath the gloves and his back stiff enough that he had to lean forward against Cornelius's neck to stay in the saddle. But he had learned something important during those 10 hours of digging. The clay, once broken loose from the bank, did not need to be hauled away. It could be piled along the base of the bluff and used later to pack the roof, insulate the outer walls of the anteroom, and build up a raised threshold to keep meltwater out of the doorway in the spring. Every shovelful of dirt he pulled from the hillside was going to become part of the shelter itself. Nothing would be wasted. Nothing would be carried farther than it needed to go. The second day went faster than the first. So did the third. By the end of the first week, Benjamin had cut a rough chamber 8 feet deep and roughly the full 12 feet wide he had staked out, though the ceiling still sagged unevenly and the back wall bulged where a stubborn seam of gravel had forced him to widen his cut. He worked without a helper, without a foreman, without a single neighbor stopping by to ask what he was doing, which was, he understood, exactly what he had wanted. Word had spread through the country, though. He knew that much because on the 8th day, riding out at dawn, he passed a wagon coming the other way along the freight trace and recognized the driver as Silas Marbury, a wheat farmer whose claim lay 2 miles east of Benjamin's own. Silas pulled up his team, looked Benjamin over from boots to hat, glanced at the picks and shovels loaded in the stone boat behind Cornelius, and said only one thing before slapping his reins and driving on. "Hollister, folks are saying you're digging your own grave down at the river. That true?" Benjamin tipped his hat and rode past without answering. By the end of the second week, the main chamber was cut nearly to its full depth of 16 feet, and Benjamin had begun the more delicate work of shaping the ceiling. This was the part of the dig that had worried him most since the first day, and it was the part where he knew a single miscalculation could kill him before the winter ever arrived. A flat ceiling of raw clay, left unsupported, would eventually sag under its own weight and drop tons of wet earth onto whatever lay beneath it. He had seen it happen once to a sod house family near Havre. The roof had come down in the middle of a July night, and the mother and 2 children had suffocated before the father could dig them free. Benjamin was not going to let that happen to his shelter. He had planned the ceiling from the very first sketch on the back of the seed catalog, and he had planned it the way Odger Lindquist had described the ceilings of the old dugouts along the Red River. He would cut the earthen ceiling into a shallow arch, high in the center and lower at the walls, so the weight of the soil above pressed inward against itself instead of straight down. Then he would line the underside of that arch with peeled cottonwood poles laid tight against one another, running the full length of the chamber from front to back. Over the poles, he would spread a double layer of the canvas tarp, then a course of split shingles cut from the roof of the frame house, then a thick blanket of dry prairie grass, then finally the living sods he had stripped from the top of the bluff during the first day of digging. 5 layers between him and the winter sky. 5 layers to keep the ceiling from ever meeting the floor. The cottonwood poles came from the river bottom half a mile downstream, where a stand of tall cottonwoods had gone through a die-off 2 summers earlier and left roughly 40 straight trunks standing dead but still sound. Benjamin cut them one at a time with the crosscut saw, working single-handed by looping a length of hemp rope through the far handle and tying it to Cornelius's harness, so that the mule pulled the far end of the blade while Benjamin pushed the near end. It was slow work and awkward, but it functioned, and by the end of the third week, he had 32 peeled cottonwood poles stacked along the top of the bluff, each one roughly 6 inches thick and 14 feet long. He laid the poles across the ceiling arch on the 22nd of October under a sky that had begun to carry the first faint threat of snow. The work took 2 full days. Each pole had to be lifted into place from below, wedged tight against its neighbor, and pinned at both ends into notches he had carved into the clay walls where the arch met the vertical. When the last pole was set, Benjamin stood in the middle of the chamber and looked up at the ceiling he had built. Rough, uneven, marked with axe scars and clay smears, but solid. Solid enough that when he struck the underside of one pole with the flat of his hand, the whole ceiling answered back like the deck of a well-built barn. He spent the next 3 days on the layers above. The canvas went down first, tacked into the top edges of the poles with square-cut nails salvaged from the porch of the frame house. The split shingles followed, laid overlapping like roofing shakes but flatter, then the prairie grass, packed dense and dry and roughly a foot thick. The living sods came last, carried up from the base of the bluff in the stone boat and fitted into place along the crown of the arch with the grass side facing the sky. By the 28th of October, the roof of the main chamber was complete. From the freight trace above, no one riding past could have told the ground had been disturbed at all. That night Benjamin wrote in the journal, "Roof holds, ceiling holds, now the doors." The doors were the part of the shelter Benjamin had been thinking about since the very first night he sketched the plan by candlelight in the empty frame house. A dugout could have the finest walls a man ever cut and the strongest ceiling ever pinned into clay, but if the doorway was wrong, the whole thing would leak heat like a torn sack leaks grain. Odger Lindquist had been very clear about that, drawing his shapes in the dust of the floor with the point of his whittling knife all those years ago in Bismarck. A doorway is where a shelter lives or dies, the old Norwegian had said. Everything else is just walls holding still. Benjamin began the anteroom on the 29th of October. He cut it 8 feet long and 6 feet wide, extending straight out from the mouth of the main chamber into the base of the bluff, so that a man entering from outside would step first into a small dim room, close the outer door behind him, and only then open the inner door into the warmth of the main chamber. Between the two doors, roughly 4 feet of dead air would sit trapped in that anteroom, doing nothing but standing still and holding its temperature. It was that trapped air, Odger had said, that made the cold trap work, not the doors themselves, the nothing between them. He built the outer door from 3 planks of pine cut down from the sitting room floor of the frame house, joined together with iron cross braces salvaged from an old wagon tongue, and hung on hinges he had pulled from the pantry cupboard. The inner door came from the kitchen door of the same house, already fitted with its brass latch and hardware, which Benjamin unscrewed carefully in the failing October light with the deed to a house he no longer owned folded inside his coat pocket. He did not feel guilty stripping the frame house. The bank had the paper. He had the winter to survive. The lumber would go to whichever of them needed it more. Both doors were hung by the 2nd of November. Benjamin fitted them tight against their jambs using strips of oiled leather tacked around the frames as weather stripping, then packed the gaps at the top and bottom with rolled wool salvaged from Marta's old quilting basket. When he closed the outer door for the first time and stood alone in the small dark anteroom listening to the wind move along the top of the bluff above him, he could hear the difference immediately. Outside, the north wind had begun to rise in short gusts along the freight trace. Inside the anteroom, the air did not move at all. It sat around him the way still water sits in a well. He opened the inner door then and stepped through into the main chamber. The change was immediate and unmistakable. The main chamber, cut deep into the bank and sealed above by 5 layers of roof, held a temperature that was neither warm nor cold but simply steady, roughly the temperature of a root cellar in autumn. Benjamin stood in the middle of the earthen floor and breathed out slowly. His breath did not fog. Inside the shelter, on the 2nd day of November, with a frost already forming on the grass above the bluff, the air was warm enough that a man's breath ran clear. He knew then that the shelter was going to hold. Not certain of it, because certainty was not something the Montana country ever handed to any man freely, but sure enough to stop worrying about the walls and start worrying about the stove. The stove came out of the frame house on the 3rd of November. It was a cast-iron cookstove Marta had ordered from a catalog in the 2nd year of their marriage, and it weighed nearly 400 pounds. Benjamin loaded it onto the stone boat with the help of two long planks laid as a ramp and Cornelius pulling steady against the harness, and he moved it across the 2 miles between the ruined homestead and the river bend in 3 careful stages, stopping twice to let the mule rest. Setting the stove inside the main chamber took Benjamin 2 full days, and it was the hardest physical work he had done since the digging began. He set it against the eastern wall, roughly 4 feet in from the inner doorway, on a hearth he built up out of flat river stones mortared together with a paste of wet clay and wood ash. The hearth had to be high enough to keep the firebox off the earthen floor, wide enough to catch any embers that might jump loose during the night, and level enough that the stove itself did not rock when he opened the cast-iron door to feed it. Benjamin fitted each stone by hand, tapping them into place with the flat of a small hammer, and by the time the hearth was done, his knuckles were bruised black across the backs of both hands. The stovepipe was the part that mattered most, and it was the part he had been planning since the very first morning at the river bend, when he had looked up at the hollow cottonwood stump standing above his chosen spot in the bluff and understood what it could become. The stump rose almost 7 feet out of the prairie soil above the dugout, weathered gray and gnarled at the top, hollow all the way through from a slow rot that had eaten out the heartwood decades earlier. From the freight trace 200 yards away, it looked like nothing at all. Just another dead cottonwood standing above the river, of which there were dozens along the bend. But inside that hollow trunk, Benjamin was going to run 6 feet of black iron stovepipe straight up from the roof of the main chamber, so that the smoke from his fire would rise through the dead stump and disperse into the winter air, without ever showing a single visible chimney to any rider passing along the trace above. He cut the hole for the pipe through the roof on the 6th of November, working from below with a hand auger and a keyhole saw, threading each section carefully up through the layered ceiling, and packing wet clay around every joint to seal it against smoke leakage. When he lit the first fire in the stove that evening, using a small handful of dry cottonwood twigs and a single sheet of newspaper, he stood back and watched the smoke draw straight up the pipe without hesitation. Not a wisp escaped into the chamber. The draft pulled clean and steady, and outside, standing on the freight trace 15 minutes later in the failing November light, Benjamin could see nothing at all rising from the top of the hollow stump. A faint shimmer of heat, perhaps, if a man knew exactly where to look, but no smoke, no plume, nothing that would tell a passing eye that a fire burned 12 feet beneath the prairie. He wrote in the journal that night by the light of the same tallow candle he had used in the frame house. November the 6th, stove drawing well, chimney invisible from the trace, first fire tonight, chamber warmed from cellar temperature to comfortable in under 2 hours on less than 3 pounds of cottonwood. If this holds through January, I will not need a quarter of what I feared. The next morning brought the first hard frost of the season, and with it, Benjamin's first visitor. Ezra Kettleman rode out from his claim 3 miles east along the freight trace at mid-morning, sitting hunched in his saddle against a wind that had begun to carry the sharp bite of true winter. Ezra was a heavy-shouldered man in his early 50s, red-faced from a lifetime of prairie sun, and he owned the largest wheat operation within 10 miles of the Maria's River Bend. He had never particularly liked Benjamin Hollister, and he had never particularly disliked him either. Ezra Kettleman kept his opinions arranged the way he kept his fence lines, straight, visible, and none of anyone else's business until they crossed onto his own. He reined up at the top of the bluff and sat looking down at the river bend for a long moment before he spoke. "Hollister," Ezra said finally, without dismounting. "Silas Marbury told me you were digging yourself into the riverbank. I told him he was drunk. Now I ride out here and find out he wasn't." Benjamin had been splitting cottonwood into stove lengths on the gravel shelf beside the water when he heard the horse above him. He straightened, wiped his hands on the front of his coat, and looked up at the man silhouetted against the pale November sky. "Morning, Ezra. You mean to winter down there?" "I do." Ezra Kettleman leaned forward in the saddle and spat once into the grass at the edge of the bluff. "Hollister, I've known men who lost their crop and men who lost their house, but I have never in my life known a man who lost both and decided to crawl into the ground rather than take help from his neighbors. My wife will feed you 3 meals a day through the freeze if you come stay in the loft above our barn. It ain't the parlor, but it's above ground. Appreciate the offer, Ezra, but you won't take it. I won't." The older man sat quiet for a long moment, studying the bluff below him. His eyes moved along the dark opening at the base of the bank where Benjamin had built up the raised threshold and hung the outer door flush against the clay. They moved up the face of the bluff to the roof line, where the living sods had already begun to knit themselves back into the soil beneath. They passed the hollow cottonwood stump above the ceiling without lingering, because there was nothing there to draw the eye. Ezra did not see a chimney. He did not see a house. He saw what everyone who rode past on the freight trace was going to see for the next 6 months, a hole in a riverbank with a door on it. "Hollister," he said at last, "I don't say this to shame you. I say it because I have buried 3 men in this country who thought they could outclever a Montana winter. It's not the cold that kills you down here, it's the damp. Clay holds water, water freezes. Frozen walls draw the heat straight out of a man's bones while he sleeps. You'll be dead by February and no one will find you until the spring thaw." Benjamin looked up at him from the gravel shelf. "The clay's been drying since October. The stove will finish it. And the walls are 2 feet thick on every side, Ezra. That's not damp. That's insulation. That's a grave with a stovepipe. Then it's a warm one." Ezra Kettleman shook his head slowly, gathered his reins, and turned his horse back toward the freight trace. He paused once at the top of the bluff and looked back down. "When you change your mind, Hollister, come to the ranch. The loft door stays unlocked." Then he rode east and did not look back. Benjamin returned to his splitting. He did not resent Ezra for the visit. In some way he could not quite explain, he was grateful for it. Because Ezra Kettleman was not a cruel man, and Ezra Kettleman was not a foolish man, and if Ezra Kettleman thought the dugout was a grave, then every other homesteader within 20 miles thought the same thing, which meant that no one was going to come looking for him through the worst of the winter. No one was going to knock on his door in the middle of a January blizzard expecting a warm parlor and hot coffee. He would be left alone, and being left alone, in the mountain country as in the wheat country, was sometimes the closest thing to safety a man could ask for. He finished the woodpile that afternoon and stacked it inside the anteroom against the western wall, dry and out of the weather. Roughly a cord and a half of split cottonwood, another half-cord of pine kindling from the porch boards of the frame house, and a small pile of pitch-heavy fatwood he had cut from the roots of a lightning-struck spruce 3 miles upriver. That night, the first snow came. The snow began just after midnight and did not stop for 3 days. Benjamin woke on the morning of the 10th of November to a silence so complete that for one long moment he could not tell whether he was still asleep. Then he opened the inner door, crossed the anteroom, and pushed against the outer door. It moved perhaps 6 inches before packed snow stopped it. He worked it back and forth patiently, digging with a small hand shovel he had left standing beside the frame, and by the time he cleared enough of an opening to step outside, he was standing knee-deep in the first true drift of the winter. The freight trace was gone. The river was a pale gray ribbon nearly invisible beneath the falling snow, and the bluff itself had softened into a smooth white curve that gave no indication of the shelter beneath it. Benjamin stood in the drift for a long time, breathing the cold, clean air, and understood then that the country had done exactly what he had been counting on it to do. It had covered him. It had hidden the door, hidden the roof, hidden even the hollow cottonwood stump beneath a cap of powder snow. From the trace above, nothing would be visible now except an unbroken field of white sweeping down to the river. He shoveled the drift back from the outer door in a careful arc, packing the snow into a curved wall on either side of the entrance rather than throwing it away. Odger Lindquist had described this trick too, all those years ago in Bismarck. A snow wall around the doorway of a dugout served the same purpose as the outer door itself, blocking the wind before it ever reached the frame, adding another layer of dead air between the storm and the shelter. By the end of the morning, Benjamin had built up a windbreak of packed snow nearly 4 feet high in a half-circle around the entrance, leaving only a narrow passage he could shovel clear each morning as he came out. The days that followed settled into a rhythm he had not felt since Marta was alive. He rose before dawn, lit the stove from the banked coals of the night before, boiled coffee in a small tin pot, and ate a breakfast of oatmeal and salt pork by the light of the tallow candle. He wrote in the journal each morning before beginning the day's work, recording the outside temperature by a thermometer he had nailed to the outer door frame, the inside temperature by a second thermometer hung above the stove, the depth of the snow along the freight trace, the condition of Cornelius in the small pole-and sod stable he had built into the bank 30 feet downstream, and the amount of firewood consumed the previous day. The numbers, when he read them back to himself at the end of the first week, told a story he could scarcely believe. On the morning of the 17th of November, the outside thermometer read 4 degrees below zero. The inside thermometer, hung above the stove in the main chamber, read 58 degrees. He had burned less than 4 pounds of cottonwood in the previous 24 hours. 4 pounds. In a frame house through a Montana November, he would have burned 40 pounds of wood a day just to keep the kitchen livable, and the bedrooms would have frozen anyway. Here, buried in the clay of the riverbank, the earth itself was doing most of the work. The stove only needed to lift the temperature the last 20 degrees. Benjamin sat at the small table he had built against the western wall and looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he wrote in the journal in a hand steadier than any he had used since Marta died. November 17, 1886. Outside 4 below, inside 58. Firewood consumption negligible. If the ratio holds through January, 1 cord will carry me through the worst of the winter. Odger Lindquist was right. The earth holds the heat. The stove only finishes it. The real cold came in the first week of December. It arrived without warning on the morning of the 4th of December, the way the deepest cold in the northern country almost always did. Benjamin woke to a stillness so profound that even the small sounds he had grown accustomed to inside the shelter, the settling of the stove, the faint creak of the cottonwood poles overhead, the shifting of Cornelius in the sod stable 30 feet away, seemed to have paused together in the darkness. He lit the candle, opened the stove door to bank a fresh log onto the coals, and crossed the anteroom to check the thermometer nailed to the outside of the outer door. The needle had dropped to 38 degrees below zero. He stood in the anteroom for a long moment looking at the reading, then closed the door carefully and returned to the main chamber. Inside, the second thermometer read 54 degrees. A difference of 92 degrees between the world above the bluff and the world inside the shelter. 92 degrees on a fire that had burned steadily, but not fiercely through the previous night on less than 5 pounds of cottonwood. By the end of that first week of December, the country outside had entered what old-timers in the southern valleys would afterward call the deep freeze. The temperature did not rise above 20 below zero for 11 straight days. The Marias River froze from bank to bank in a single night, the ice groaning and cracking under its own weight, until it settled into a solid gray sheet nearly 2 feet thick. Cattle began to die across the county, first the older animals, then the calves born too late in the previous spring, then finally the working stock that farmers had counted on to pull their spring plows. Ezra Kettleman lost 14 head of shorthorn cattle in a single week. Silas Marbury lost his entire remuda of 6 horses when the roof of his pole barn collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. In Fort Benton, the newspaper that Benjamin would not see until March reported that the winter of 1886 and 1887 was already, by mid-December, the coldest recorded on the northern plains in 40 years. Benjamin recorded none of this at the time, because he had no way of knowing it. He knew only what his thermometers told him each morning and what the stillness above the bluff sounded like each night. But he wrote in the journal every day, and the journal, when read back later by lamplight in the parlors of neighbors who had not believed him, would tell the story more clearly than any newspaper. December the 10th. Outside -31. Inside 51. Burned 6 pounds of wood in 24 hours. Cornelius Sound. Ice fishing hole cut through the floor of the anteroom yesterday. 2 grayling and 1 whitefish taken in under an hour. Fresh fish tonight for the first time since October. The ice fishing hole had been Benjamin's own idea, not something Odger Lindquist had ever mentioned, and he had been mildly proud of it since the day he cut it. The gravel shelf outside the anteroom sloped down to the river at a shallow angle, and the frost line had already driven the water back beneath nearly 2 feet of solid ice by the first week of December. Benjamin had realized that if he cut a small opening through the floor of the anteroom itself, where the earthen floor lay only inches above the frozen gravel of the shelf, he could reach down through the shelter floor and chop directly into the river ice without ever going outside into the wind. He had done exactly that on the 9th of December, chopping through 18 inches of ice with a hand axe while kneeling on the floor of his own house, and by the 10th, he was pulling grayling out of the Marias River through a hole cut into the floor of a room he had built himself. He kept the fishing hole covered with a wooden lid when not in use, sealed against the cold with a rim of rolled wool. It became, in his private accounting of the winter, the single feature of the shelter that pleased him most. Then, on the night of December the 22nd, the Kettleman house burned to the ground. Benjamin never learned exactly how the fire started. Ezra told him afterward, sitting hunched beside the stove in the main chamber with his hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee and his youngest daughter sleeping in the crook of his arm, that it had likely been a cracked flue in the parlor chimney. The temperature outside had been 36 degrees below zero. The wind had been steady out of the north at nearly 20 miles an hour. By the time Ezra had smelled the smoke and gotten his wife and 4 children out of the upstairs bedrooms, the roof was already gone. They had walked 6 miles across open country in the middle of the night in weather that killed cattle standing in barns. Ezra had wrapped the youngest child inside his own coat. His wife Hannah had carried the second youngest on her back beneath a wool blanket. The 3 older children had walked on their own feet, holding hands in a chain behind their father, following the freight trace by moonlight because the snow was too deep to cut across country. They had passed within a mile of 2 other homesteads and had not stopped at either one. Ezra told Benjamin later that he did not know why. He said only that when the house had gone up behind them and he had stood in the yard with his family gathered around him in the freezing dark, the first thought that had come into his head was the hole in the riverbank down at the Maria's Bend. They arrived at Benjamin's outer door just before 4 in the morning on the 23rd of December. Benjamin heard the pounding through 2 doors and a wall of packed snow, and by the time he had lit the candle and crossed the anteroom, he already knew from the sound alone that something had gone very badly wrong somewhere out in the country above. He brought them in one at a time. Ezra first with the youngest child, then Hannah with the second, then the 3 older children in a shivering line. He sat them along the western wall beside the woodpile and built the stove up until the main chamber was warmer than it had been at any point since he had lit the first fire in November. He gave them everything he had, blankets from the bed, the wool coat Marta had made him the winter before her illness, every strip of salt pork and every handful of oatmeal in the food chest, hot coffee, then hot water with sugar, then more coffee. The youngest child had frostbite on both ears and on the tips of 3 fingers of her left hand. Benjamin thawed them slowly against the skin of his own chest beneath his shirt, the way his mother had taught him to do for a lamb when he was a boy in Minnesota, and by dawn the child was crying, which he took to mean that the tissue had come back. They stayed 6 weeks, 7 people in a shelter Benjamin had built for one. The main chamber, 16 feet deep and 12 feet wide, became a bedroom by night and a kitchen by day. The anteroom became a second sleeping space for the older children, packed with straw hauled up through the ice fishing hole from the gravel shelf. The stove burned harder than Benjamin had ever asked it to burn, and even so, the woodpile in the anteroom lasted longer than any of them had a right to expect, because the earth itself was still doing most of the work. When the spring thaw came at last in the first week of April, the bank assessor rode out from Fort Benton to inventory the frame house on Benjamin Hollister's claim and found nothing there to inventory. The house had been stripped to the foundation stones. The lumber, the doors, the windows, the stove, the hinges, the nails, all of it was gone. The assessor rode down to the river bend to find Benjamin, and what he found instead was a line of 17 farmers standing along the freight trace above the bluff, waiting their turn to speak with the man who had spent the coldest winter in 40 years living in a hole in the ground, and who was now, quietly and without charging a single dollar, teaching each of them how to dig their own.